all during this 30 years, the United States had the upper hand. And the United States used the upper hand in a very arrogant way. It launched wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya. It made coups. It abandoned the nuclear arms framework unilaterally.
So recently, Jeffrey Sachs was on the Krasno UNC podcast and talks a little bit about the history of the war in Ukraine, what led to it, and who is most at fault for it. Because there's a lot of players here. There's the US, there's Ukraine, there's Russia, there's NATO. Let's see where Jeffrey Sachs comes down on this, and let's watch and let's react. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel also.
It's a little more complicated even than this because of the following. In 2002, the United States unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty. This was probably the single most destabilizing event in the 21st century for U.S.-Russia relations. Russia thought, okay, the United States is abandoning the core principle of how we maintain deterrence, and this was done unilaterally.
Yeah, the only thing I'll disagree with Sachs on there, and he makes a good point, that's arguable that juncture was one of the worst parts of creating a schism between U.S. and Russian relations, but actually the U.S. intervention in Syria was too, because of what happened thereafter. Because before that, actually U.S. leaders, U.S. presidents spoke glowingly of Putin. George Bush famously said that he looked into his eyes and saw an honest man, right? But in Syria, the U.S. intervened there on a trajectory to enact a regime change against Assad, which Russia interfered with because they moved into Syria, occupied part of it, and it was a big part of the 2016 presidential election to talk about this because of how things could unfold and go toward a World War II or a new Cold War with Russia. That eventually did happen, but it wasn't exactly over Syria. It was more over Ukraine, as we know now.
In 2010, the United States started to put in, against heated Russian objections, anti-ballistic missile silos, the Aegis missile systems, first in Poland and then in Romania. In 2019, the United States unilaterally abandoned the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement. So from Russia's point of view, what the United States was doing step by step was coming to Russia's border with the U.S. military and its missile systems. According to Ray McGovern, the former CIA analyst, he describes how in January 2022, Blinken, Secretary of State, said to the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, that the United States reserved the right to put in missile systems wherever it wanted, as long as the host country agreed, including Ukraine. I wasn't party to that conversation, obviously, but the interpretation is consistent with everything I know, because I did speak to the White House in December 2021, begged them to negotiate rather than to continue what was a sure path to war.
And it's so ridiculous to call that not a pretext for saber rattling or bellicosity or heightened tensions with a power. What would the U.S. do if China started to put a Chinese-styled Aegis missile system on the border of the Rio Grande River in Mexico? What would they do if Russia did the same on the northern border near Vancouver, you know, pointing the weaponry toward Washington and toward the Northwest? This would not be tolerated, especially if those powers were also trying to incorporate those countries into their military alliance. That have, you know, the NATO fans always say, well, it's just a defensive alliance. Well, I'm sorry, Libya doesn't think that. The Balkans and Serbia doesn't think that. And Afghanistan doesn't think that. So NATO is not a defensive alliance. It hasn't proven to be so. So these attitudes really are what spiraled out of control and got the U.S.-Russian relations to where they are today, unfortunately.
I said in December 2021 to Jake Sullivan, announce that NATO will not enlarge to Ukraine and you can avoid the war. And he said to me, no, we will not announce that Ukraine cannot enter NATO. He actually said to me, don't worry, NATO's not expanding. I said, Jake, NATO's not expanding, but you can't say it in public? He said, yes. I said, well, then you're going to have a war. And in January 2022, when the United States refused to rule out even putting missile systems into Ukraine, and when there was a continued massive military buildup of the Ukrainian army, and this we really need to understand as well, because it became a several 100,000 NATO armed unit that was attacking the Donbass, as everybody, including the OSCE observers, say. Russia said, we're not going to permit de facto or to slide into being surrounded by the United States.
But
so
don't you make
okay,
it?
so I'm gonna answer your question the following way. The war could have been avoided so many times had the United States taken an honest position. And then something that I do think is absolutely important and also not part of our understanding and discourse. What was Russia trying to do when it invaded on February 24th, 2022? I'll give you my interpretation. They were trying to scare the wits out of Zelensky that he would agree to neutrality. Because what happened, in fact, was within about a week of the invasion, Zelensky said, oh, you know what? We don't have to join NATO. We could have neutrality. And within 2 weeks, actually, the Ukrainians approached the Russians and said, you know, we don't have to go on with this. And the Russians said to the Ukrainians, give us a document of what you have in mind. And they did. And that document went to President Putin. And President Putin said, you know what? We can negotiate on this basis. And what came immediately was negotiations under the auspices of Turkey. And this became known as the Istanbul process. I have had extensive discussions with the Turkish diplomats about this. So on March 28, Ukraine and Russia issued a joint communique. This is March 28, 2022, issued a joint communique saying we have a framework for peace. And it was based on Ukrainian neutrality. It was based on Crimea being outside of the agreement. In other words, Russia's not going to negotiate that. And it was based on essentially implementing the Minsk II agreement in the Donbass.
And what happened there, I'm assuming he's going to explain it, but I think he kind of skipped over one thing that's relevant. But I'll just say that Boris Johnson and probably the U.S. State Department, the Biden administration, talked Biden out of this. He said, don't worry, you can continue your war with Russia. You can send men to the front line. We got your back. Don't worry about it. We'll support you. And that's when the money funneling process started happening to Ukraine. But of course, a lot of that money, as it always is in war, was hijacked by the military-industrial complex in the U.S. But the thing that he doesn't mention here, and I know he knows all about this because he's talked about it in other places, but before Putin launched the invasion of Ukraine, he sent a draft treaty to NATO that even Jens Stoltenberg talked about, where he said, if you just put it in writing and sign this draft treaty saying that you will not add Ukraine to NATO, I won't invade Ukraine. And instead of doing that, Jens Stoltenberg basically scoffed at it and laughed at him, tauntingly said, well, he's got the exact opposite. Now he's at war with NATO and with the US. he got exactly the opposite of what he wanted, as if that's some consolation after hundreds of thousands of people have died in this fruitless affair. But it's wise to know that under the Istanbul framework that Sachs is referencing here, it didn't even acknowledge any claims by Russia on the Donbas territory. So Zelensky could have gotten that out of Istanbul. But now, hundred thousands of men later, some people think there's as many as 1 million casualties that have happened in Ukraine. All the closures of the Eastern Orthodox Church, expansions of conscription, devastated infrastructure, disease spreading, all sorts of issues, the dissolution of rival political parties to Zelensky, were continued on this course. The U.S. continues to send money there, and Zelensky's not going to get the Donbass anymore, even though he will try.
But doesn't that all sound as if you were defending Putin for invading or making us understand that
yes, I'm
there's no
explaining.
other option but to invade?
No. What I'm explaining is that this war could have ended in about the war starts in 2014 by my chronology, but the invasion, February 24th, could have ended in 2 weeks because it was a ploy to force the neutrality back onto the agenda, which Putin had tried to do in December 2021.
What about the long rows of tanks which were heading towards Kyiv, trying obviously to topple the government in Kyiv?
No, I wouldn't say that. What they were.
No, they never had the objective of taking Kyiv. That had always been a neocon rumor that, Putin would try to take Kyiv and Ukraine proper, reconstitute the Soviet Union, all this nonsense that's constantly spread. Like he's going to invade Poland tomorrow, or if the U.S. pulls out support from Ukraine, he's going to attack Poland next. There's no basis for any of this. This is all junk designed to propagandize the American people, the people of Europe, and the people of the West to continue sending money into this fruitless proxy war that's being waged on behalf of U.S. empire building and the U.S. government's perception that Ukraine's just a pawn on the chessboard of unlimited empire. That's essentially what this is.
Were trying to do was intimidate the government, and they were withdrawn as soon as that document was exchanged. That's what actually happened. They were trying to intimidate Zelensky. And, this is really important from my point of view. I said to Sullivan in December 2021, Ukrainian neutrality is not a concession. It's a benefit for everybody. It's a benefit for Ukraine. It's a benefit for the United States. It's a benefit for Russia. Keep a buffer between the two superpowers. Don't press your luck, Jake. Said, no, anyway, NATO's not expanding. But he wouldn't say it in public because they didn't mean it. Of course, they wanted to do what they wanted to do because they were playing poker. And to my mind, just to explain, on April 15, 2022, this is basically 8 weeks after the start of Russia's invasion, an agreement was reached with a few clauses still to be finalized. And you can find that online. The New York Times published the agreement. They were close to ending the war. Now, we know that the United States stepped in at that moment and said, don't do it, told the Ukrainians, keep fighting.
Boris Johnson.
Boris Johnson came physically around that time, but the British are not independent agents in this. This was a U.S. policy that this war should continue. And why? Again, I know why. I happen to see some of it. The U.S. deeply believed that they were about to crush the Russian economy, that cutting Russia out of SWIFT was going to bring the Russian economy to its knees. They really believed that. I talked to a lot of senior U.S. officials at the time. I never believed that. I had never seen sanctions actually lead to a fundamental political change.
And that's such an important part of this, too, because sanctions are always the means in which nations fight economic warfare against other powers, such as the same in the case of US policy toward Russia. But really what sanctions do is mostly just hurt civilians, and they arm the government of that country, meaning Russia in this case, with a propaganda tool, because what they said is essentially the US is at fault here. We have to wage this war because the US has placed you in the condition in which you are, where it's harder to get goods and services. There's a lot of poor parts of Russia. It's a pretty prosperous economy in the grand scheme of things relative to a lot of other countries, but not nearly as prosperous as the US, and there are a lot of poor regions as well. A lot of people languishing and suffering under these sanctions that gives these countries and their leaders the propaganda tools to say this is the US's fault. We have to wage this war because of what they've done to us. That is the case in so many wars. That's how Saddam Hussein propagandized his people to fight back against the US. They didn't put up too much of a fight, but then we know what happened with the insurgency that happened afterward, just as in Afghanistan. So these are always tools that backfire. Sanctions never really have a great benefit, and it was foolhardy for the US to think that they could collapse the Russian economy over this. It's just absurd.
In the sanctioned country, it usually is a reason for those governments to toughen up. So in any event, they believed that Russia was not going to survive any of this. So they made the gamble, and the Ukrainians bought into it. We don't have to agree to this treaty. Incidentally, Naftali Bennett, who was the prime minister of Israel, was informally acting as a mediator alongside Turkey. And Bennett gave a remarkably open and kind of discursive interview a couple of years ago where he said, yeah, this agreement was close, but the United States stepped in and said no. And then Bennett said they did it because they thought they would look weak to China. So that this became something about sending signals, looking tough, and so forth.
And what's so absurd about that is how big did that backfire? To think that you'd be looked at as weak to China, but what's happened as a partial result of this? One of the ancillary reactions to this is that Russia has been driven farther into the arms of the Chinese. There's now a Russo-Sino alliance. The two powers actually went to war with each other about 120 years ago, but now they're more close than ever. Both BRICS countries both have antagonistic attitudes toward U.S. expansionism, and that's about the worst thing that you could possibly hope for if you're an earnest, honest, logical U.S. diplomat trying to avert catastrophes and tensions with nuclear powers, one of which has the biggest stockpile in the world. That's Russia. So this was horrible in so many ways. To look tough to China is just so stupid.
And
a lot of people would say you have a very benign interpretation of Putin's motives and what he was after.
I do.
Yeah.
Because, you know why? Because all during this 30 years, the United States had the upper hand. And the United States used the upper hand in a very arrogant way. It launched wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya. It made coups. It abandoned the nuclear arms framework unilaterally. So I put most of the onus on the United States.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with that. If anything, up until 2022, Putin showed remarkable restraint in some ways in dealing with this thing as the waves of NATO expansion unfolded, as the US bombed Serbia for 42 straight days as part of the Balkan campaigns, when the US provided the Aegis missile systems to Ukraine, after president said that Ukraine will be part of NATO, and we're going to include them in our military alliance, and we're going to put missiles on their border, such that they could strike targets in Ukraine. After the US intervened in Syria, who's become an ally of Russia, after time and time again, Putin actually urged restraint. Now, that's not to justify the invasion. I look at Putin's invasion much like I look at things like, September 11th, where, an attack was made But there were things leading up to that attack. It doesn't justify the attack, but there's obvious reasons, and bin Laden cited them. He said U.S. support for Israel, U.S. sanctions in Iraq, and U.S. occupation of the Arabian Peninsula, things like that. I'm not saying that, you know, this is analogous in every single way, but everything that plays out in history, the neocons and the people that support these wars and escalating them and getting them involved in the part of the U.S. is always dependent on pretending that history began yesterday. In this case, that's Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but so many things preceded it, including the overthrow of the Yanukovych government. He was the elected president of Ukraine in the Maidan coup of 2014, where we know the U.S. assisted in the overthrow, was deeply involved in selecting the provisional government thereafter. There's a leaked tape between Victoria Nuland and the ambassador at that time in Ukraine, Jeffrey Sachs, and you can find that tape on YouTube now. So Sachs is totally right about the history of this thing, and there's lots of forces that are culpable, but it seems like there were so many off-ramps, but the U.S. was so dead set, regardless of presidential administration, it seemed, for the most part, of getting involved in this, expanding NATO, exacerbating tensions with Russia, up to and including overthrowing their government so it was more bellicose toward Russia. And that's where we're at today. But I do want to get your opinion down below. Do you agree with Jeffrey Sachs? Do you think a peace will come to Ukraine soon because Trump is showing some willingness to negotiate directly with Russia? As of the recording of this video, Steve Witkoff actually met with Putin as of yesterday, I believe. So we'll see what comes from that. Let me know if you think a peace will be established soon. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll see you in the next one.